We are in Living the Cities, a digital program. I'm Tatjana Schneider. I'm one of the co-curators of the exhibition which is called Living the City, an exhibition about cities, people, and stories. And what I'm going to do tonight, what we're going to do tonight is as a bit of a first, we're in lockdown mode, of course. The exhibition is closed and we shifted our program of double features of talks and lectures into the digital space. And we have tonight with us Jeanne van Heeswijk and artist Jeanne van Heeswijk and editor, writer Anh-Linh. And before I continue to introduce Jeanne and later on Anh-Linh, I want to say just a few words about the exhibition of which this event tonight is, of course, part of, and of which you see a picture in the background. So cities, as we write in the introduction to the book, are full of stories, and they're simultaneous, they're contradicting, and they're overlapping. And against this backdrop of very complex stories and things that cities always bring up, this exhibition tells of many different ways of doing cities. We have examples of projects and people and initiatives and organizations from across Europe and beyond, who from art, architecture, from urban planning, that address questions around the making of cities. And they relate the urban as a lived space while also introducing the possibilities afforded by what you might want to call integrated urban development. So we're having with us tonight two people who will speak very broadly, I guess, of those topics as well. And I'm very glad to have both of you here. I'll introduce Jeanne first and would then pass on the screen to you, Jeanne. So Jeanne is an Rotterdam-based artist who facilitates the creation of dynamic and diversified public spaces to what she very often calls radicalize the local. And she is known, I would say, at least I know her from such projects, a very wide range of projects that work and combine also performative actions, discussions, and other ways of organizing and of pedagogy as very often. And it's the long scale community embedded projects that I find especially interesting, also in the context of the exhibition, which also talks about the fights necessary often to engage in your neighborhoods to realize things. And sometimes, as Jeanne's projects span well over a decade, and these projects question then also in so many ways not only art's autonomy, but also architecture and urban planning's seeming need to organize spaces according to principles that often do not benefit the communities affected by those reorganizations. And we could talk here for a while about a project such as Two Up and Two Down, of course, which originally started as a commission out of the Liverpool biennial, but extended well beyond the period of the biennial. And there she was working with people from the neighborhood of Anfield and Breckfield to rethink the future of this area. But we could also talk about projects that develop curricula of community learnings through a series of formats, frameworks, and other such things. And another involvement of hers is with the network, you might want to call it Practice Urban Front, of course, which was launched last year during the Chicago Architecture Biennial and is made up of independent associates from around the world. And I'm not sure whether you're going to talk about Front tonight, but I think it's a really interesting engagement to work with such practitioners across the globe as well. Since September 2020, she's also fellow of BAK, Basis für aktuelle Kunst in Utrecht, where she explores the possibilities of art as public good and side of public pedagogy. So I'm very happy you're here with us tonight, and I'll pass the mic to you. Thank you, Jeanne.
Thank you for having me, for talking on this symposium, and for this wonderful introduction. I'm not going to talk about Too Up to Down Home Baked, but about other projects. Could you? Yeah, I'm just going to share my screen now. And I should. Thank you. I titled for today my talk around the notion of dreamscaping, how to create collective topographies of political daring dreams and embodied community knowledges. As an artist, I've been working collectively with different kinds of publics for 3 decades. To me, the investigative and explorative qualities of the arts should serve a process in which we can collectively learn how we can engage and act upon the world in order to renegotiate the condition of our existence. When I'm speaking about practice, it's not a singular practice, but a collaborative undertaking that shapes durational commitment. Here, I'm sharing some collective processes that led to the community learnings and the way in which they materialized as landscapes of dreams at trainings for the not yet at BAK, Basis voor Actuele Kunst in Utrecht, and where they were daily trained with the different communities involved. The landscapes of dreams seeks to draw a collective topography through non-linear timelines, maps of resistance, and community imaginaries, driven by the ideal that if only the extraordinary wealth of community competence generated from everyday life and ordinary struggles for survival could be linked up, one could build a new, radical form beyond what seems thinkable today. Dreamscaping brings together living repositories of different knowledges, stories, and embodied practices. It engages with questions such as, how do we collectively work to understand the conditions of power inscribed in specific geographies and take matters into our own hands for the future? How do we identify strategies to radicalize the local? How do communities pool their resources and strengthen their ties, knitting stronger networks? And how might these be transformed into urban unions whereby new organizational and economic forms can be created? Our immediate environment has been for a long time under the pressure of globalization. More and more people feel left out of the way that their daily environment is shaped, formed, governed, and financed. And this quite often leads to a serious disconnect between institutions and governments. In my work, I always question the way in which we can not only take matters into our own hands in relation to the future of our areas, but how can we collectively try to imagine futures that are more just and that include more of our narratives and histories than at present. I create fields of interactions circumscribed by questions around how can we shape the place we live? How can we find ways in which we want to live together in this rapid, changing world? How can we get grip on the process of design, regulation, policy making, and how can people join and influence these processes? How can people have their say and take responsibilities? To me, these are political questions, and they're also questions of the imaginary. They're questions of political imaginaries. Or as Ursula Le Guin said, to learn which questions are unanswerable and not to answer them, this skill is most needful in times of stress and darkness. So when the future is not known, How do we train for this? For what I call the not yet. Training for the not yet is a foundational part of my practice. My public faculties, of which I've been showing you some images, is my sketchbook. It involves standing 4 days at a location where there's pressure in the city and speaking to whomever wants to join in and talk about the issues at hand. Public faculty participants listen for nuance that can reveal the emotional texture of a place, which is impossible to discern unless through collective, digital, and radical listening. In Bach, the faculty involved into the so-called staircase of the city conversations, a relay of over 100 people discussing the future of Utrecht. For me, David Harvard's notion of the right to the city is essential for this purpose. He argues that in order to build cities towards our heart's desire, and he literally uses heart's desire, we have to understand that this is not an individual desire, but a collective process. There's a very difficult balance to be found between collective and individual desires. Individual desires to live well, to have a safe and healthy environment with your family, to have food on the table, and to be able to have work, to be able to send your kid to school, as well as a collective negotiation of what that could mean for the city as a whole. In the work, this very difficult balance between individual desires and collective urgency plays out, and COVID has just emphasized the need to develop collectively even more. What is now emergent is the work lots of people already have been doing to prepare for a moment like this. How can we find ways to balance between the individual desires and the collective urgencies that are at work in the local? Repetitively asking how can we turn our political and economic choices into concrete actions for change, and how to move towards collective action despite our differences. How can we listen to the emotional conditions of our city and act collectively upon this? Here it's important to think about collective as a performative activity, to approach the notion of collective not as a pre-existing social structure, but as an actively becoming in context. In the work, we collectively work to understand better the conditions of power inscribed in the neighborhood and to take matters into our own hands regarding the future development of an area, finding strategies of radicalizing the local. Often, vibrant cultural production and activities can't take place in public due to restrictive regulation and honoring permanent rules imposed by local government that pre-roll new development plans which add layers and layers of displacement. Since 2008, Friers have been working in the Afrikanenwijk, a neighborhood socially and economically marginalized in the south of Rotterdam, the first in the Netherlands to have a majority of its residents with a migratory background, and with that its interracial conflicts. The name Afrikanenwijk, and with that the names of streets such as Paul Kruger and Pretoria Laan, are daily reminders of a colonial past of exclusion and systemic inequality, and with the expansion of the creative city from the city center towards the south, the so-called local government strategic plan for the area for 2030, and with that its planned gentrification, another layer of displacement was added. Friaus worked twofold. First, it focused its effort around the highly regulated Afrikaner market, in which it actively challenges restriction in over 300 interventions. Performative actions, or what I call acts of civil disobedience, are often the only way to de-abstract space. Here, the performative should be understood as a way to try to decolonize space, a form of urban architecture. Second, we also went door to door in the neighborhood to research and identify the unrecognized skills and capability of its inhabitants, the curry makers, the knitters, the builders, the painters, and the spoken word artist. And we started to facilitate opportunities to both sell good and showcase talent on the market. And we opened up a series of collaborative workspaces in empty shops that still run today, to accommodate collaborative production. For me, it is important to set up camp, meaning creating independent community workplaces that can accommodate collective production and allow individual makers to pool their resources and strengthen their ties, knitting stronger networks into urban unions, creating new organizational form as well as economic form. A process of social, economic and cultural activities that moved on various levels and makes the different informal practices of the everyday emergence, while at the same time rerouting them into stronger networks. This is what I call radicalizing the local. The Wijkkoop mission statement reads, "The Wijkkoop is a self-organized and self-run body that works on creating local, self-produced economic opportunities for the neighborhood, leveraging political power to shift policy and negotiate economic advantages, developing local skills and self-certification, and strengthen resilient intercultural networks, trying to create a radical form of self-governance of an area." And because the Wijkkoop is self-produced, the vast diversity of cultures, education levels, economic classes, and individual agendas it encompasses, it must also be self-critical and reflective. The kind of culture, the culture of self-organization, can only be built through millions of conversations, millions of interactions, crossing paths, and working together millions of time. And here you see some of the diagram of all the conflicting regulations that have been in work in the Afrikanerwijk since we've been working on trying to detect them, which led to the building of the Afrikanerwijk co-op, which is a co-op on the scale of a neighborhood. Within the trainings for the Not Yet of the BAC exhibition, the act of balance showed the delicate balance between urgencies in the Afrikanerwijk, but it was also at the same time used as a discussion forum. Here you see it operated by Urban Front in its first meeting. The work is a way to exercise the right to imagine a collective future. It tells a story of radical community building and active resistance. It articulates a collective narrative about the city and some of its most important issues. And I want to take you here to Philadelphia, and I think everybody is watching what the vote will be in Pennsylvania, for discussing the project Philadelphia Assembled. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, and you see it here on the picture, invited me to think of the relationship between the museum and the city at large. I started with a process of deep listening into the emotional conditions of the city, asking questions about its embodied spirit. From those conversations, there surfaced a repeated pattern to seek out alternative forms of participation and negotiation in response to the city's changing political, social, economic, and emotional condition. Within Philadelphia Assembled, those patterns were termed atmospheres of democracy, like reconstruction, sovereignty, futures, sanctuary, and movement. Reconstruction engaged with the rewritten personal and historical narratives and reimagining the built environment. Sovereignty asked questions about self-determination, autonomy, and forms of freedom. Futures seek to reclaim the past and the present in order to decolonize and liberate the future. And sanctuary unpacked the complexity of seeking and making safer space across the city. These questions lead to what I term field of interactions, from which ongoing conversations and collaborations emerge. These fields are spaces in which you perform yourself and your understanding of the world, a field of tension in which people actively exercise what it means to live together. In my work, collaborators always collectively embody the role of the artist and bring their skill sets and methodologies to the table, where they are co-creators and co-teachers. In this, they take on the responsibility of holding the project. And here you see the artistic team of Philadelphia assembled from left to right. Sherry Hurst, Damon Reeves, Denise Valentine, Mabel Negrete, Katrina Baxter, sorry people, Katrina Baxter, Amanda Soroka, Phoebe Bachman, Nahat Kader, and me in the corner. What began as a series of conversations and gatherings manifested in the spring of 2017 as a choreography of programs and installations throughout the city. The different working groups were asked to highlight 2 practices in the city which they thought were important. They were ranging from soul generation workshops at urban creators, building a floor plan of an affordable house to host discussions on redlining and gentrification, working with the Alumni Ex-Offenders Association to create a procession of lighting the bridges, a traveling mobile dome, a Towards Sanctuary dome with a sanctuary curriculum that after the project got installed at Urban Creators as a space of learning, and a Mobile Futures Institute that still travels today. Reassembling what emerged from these conversations and public actions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, in the exhibition of Philadelphia Assembled, it activated the museum walls, transforming its spaces into a civic stage where the city was daily performed. And I think it's important to say that this is not in the main building, but in one of the buildings that is next to it, as the collaborators of Philadelphia Assembled thought it to be important to take over the whole ground floor of that building, including its library, its exhibition spaces, its cafe, and its discussion spaces. One of the things is that we installed the so-called city panorama, which visualized the complex network of people, histories, and aesthetics that is Philadelphia Assembled. Each panel suggested a new framework through which to see the shifting landscape of the city, addressing the histories that are often made invisible by dominant systems and linear understandings of time. These range in the scale from the personal to the local to the global. The galleries were filled with objects, stories, installations that were carried from the different locals, manifesting community belongings. Ame Karila Rowe describes our belongings as the movement from being constituted as an individual self to belonging towards the other, thus creating a type of fluid rationality. This other can be thought of as a community, another person, an object, a space, a place, a feeling, an urgency, etc. With this in mind, our belongings are deeply rooted in the political conditions we live, each holding a set of power relationships, creating a politics of relation. Learning and understanding our belongings allows us to actively question and imagine how we are in relation to one another, our surrounding world, and our structures of power. In the exhibition, through conversations and gathering, public actions and programs, meals and installations, we collectively build imaginary of the future by performing our own stories and reworking them together. Just showing you some images so you get an idea. And one of the things that was very important for this exhibition was that we took off over the restaurant of the building and asked the caterer that normally works in the Philadelphia Museum of Art to make place for a series of community cooks who collectively cooked for the whole duration of the exhibition, which took place a few months, different community meals with discussions around foods that served survival, resistance, and victory. In Bach, as part of the training for the Not Yet, the kitchen was also reactivated as the basic activist kitchen. As collectively we can imagine a just future with complexity and care, both militant and empathic. It is about practicing modes of embodied being together and thinking about which different realities need sharing and repetitively practiced and performed together. Here you see David from the Afrikanenwijk Co-op meeting Denise Valentine from Philadelphia Assembled, discussing strategies of actually mapping community wealth onto the map of the city. Collective exercises for a future where we can imagine unprecedented ways of being together means to listen to one another, become frustrated, become uncomfortable, and practice learning and unlearning together. An open, conflictuous, durational, and inclusive process is a steep learning curve full of political uncertainties for all involved. The Philadelphia Assembled Sanctuary Dome traveled to Bach as part of training of the Not Yet, and it hosted trainings with different communities around collective self-determination, mutual care, and accessibility, asking, in the words of Carmen Papalia, interdependence is central to radical restructure of power. And for this, we need to be working at it again and again in order to create a place that allows us to perform our ideas, to negotiate hope, to collectively imagine our futures and build forms of solidarity. Denise Valentine opened trainings for the Not Yet, telling stories of unforgetting and reconnecting community resistance. In her words, rising, claiming, rooting, caring. This is how we practice and perform, living and working together to build political daring dreams. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanne. It's one of the big disadvantages of this digital space that you can't hear clapping, that you don't see anyone really, no? But feel treasured. Thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. There's many questions I have. The format now would be that I have Instagram Live here next to me, and if anyone wanted to ask a question via this format, we would have maybe a couple or so before I move on to introduce Anh-Linh, we take it. We can also take questions at the back. If you want to save it now, please come back later. But maybe in the meantime, I'll just ask one question. So you, it's quite funny that you mentioned Ursula Le Guin. I have the book just sitting right next to me, and of course, much of what you talked about comes out of a very strong sort of feminist discourse. No, I don't know whether people notice, but you use constantly you talk of knowledges, you talk about histories, constantly sort of engaging with the plurality, I guess, of what surrounds us. And but then you also talk about deep listening. And I guess, with also the pictures you showed, you also showed the complexity of that task, I guess, at hand, because people speak different languages, they have different cultures, they have different forms of engagement, and so on and so forth. And I wondered whether you could talk a little bit more about this kind of deep listening and how you do it. How do you engage?
Sorry, I muted myself. I think these processes of deep listening are very important, and they're a very important part of my practice, let's say it like that. And this means also spending time to basically engage in conversations about where people feel if they have agency or not, how they describe if they have any grip on the situation, or how they feel they can imagine a future, and how they bring their own histories or herstories into the picture. And this process of deep listening is also, for that, it's also very important to be able to let go of one's own position, subject position, and to try to commit oneself to listen to other realities and be able to allow other realities to speak to you without already having an idea about where you think things need to go. So yes.
Yeah. So do you I don't know, you start somewhere and then you snowball out? You drift somehow, you have a couple of points, anchor points, and then you go on and find. But do you also translate that kind of knowledge, or do you let it speak for itself? How do you work with the material that you then find?
I think what is very important for the practice is that I do not translate. What I try to do is from these conversations where I listen in, is to derive questions, or to bring questions into what I call a field of interaction, in which I then invite the people who brought the questions forward to become co-collaborators, and I become one of them. So I step into the field myself. And then that is a field of interaction. So from there on, I'm also not the creator or the editor or the whatever you call that of the project, but I'm one of the co-participants of it. And that means that we need to start building collectively, and with all the difficulties that come there, to build collectively across differences, across fractured territories, across misunderstandings. And so this is a very frictious practice as well. These processes are not easy. The processes of working with the working groups, which were consisting of like 25 peoples in Philadelphia. So in total there were 150 people over almost 2 years, weekly engaged in these discussions about the future of their city. So of course there are multiple stories, narratives, and convictions at work.
Mm. And you talked about some of these objects and things having afterlives in a way. So the Mobile Institute of Futures, of course, and the tent traveling to other locations. What about the stories themselves? How do they live on?
I think the stories live on in multiple ways. We have a very extensive website that brings these knowledges together, which is still active today, trying to bring updates on whatever the extended PHLA family wants to communicate on it. But in many forms. They live on in other collaborations that sprang off on it, in booklets, in publications, in collaborations, in very many ways.
Okay. I find, sorry, thank you very much, I think, for now. I've been checking questions or so, but I don't think there's any coming up via Instagram. So maybe I'll close this now here, and I'll bring you back later again, if that's okay with you. If I could ask, yeah, thank you very much again, Jana. So I clap now, just me on my own. So if I could ask Anh-Linh to join me. Thank you very much, Anh-Linh, for being here tonight. And I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting crossovers and discussion points afterwards. But let me introduce yourself first. Anh-Linh studied architecture. He is an author and, of course, editor of the architectural journal Arch+. He is also co-founder of a range of other initiatives and research projects and other collaborations. He is co-founder of the international initiative project Bauhaus, which through a series of formats, a symposia, workshop, and exhibitions, pop-up exhibitions, but also performances, critically examined the ideas of or behind the Bauhaus. He was from 2010 to 2016, he was member of the Kunstbeirat of the Institute für Auslandsbeziehungen, Institute for External Relations, for which he developed the traveling exhibition Post-All City. That was quite a while ago, I think back in 2009, 10 or so. And he co-initiated and curated the exhibition An Atlas of Commoning, Orte des Gemeinschaffens. And this premiered in Berlin in 2018, but has been traveling, I think, to 1 or 2 locations since, but will be traveling for another 8 years. So that's quite some perspective in a way. He's member of the advisory board for the International Building Exhibition, the Ihre in Stuttgart, City Region Stuttgart, which is 2027. And the last thing I want to mention is of course, in January 2020, he received alongside colleagues of the Arch Plus the Kunstpreis, the art prize of the Academy of Arts, the Autonomie der Kunst, in the section Baukunst, a prize which is normally awarded, if I'm correct here, to architects for artistic achievements. But here, for the first time, at least to my knowledge, the academicians awarded this prize to an architectural journal, and this is quite something because of course it acknowledges also your contribution and Arch Plus contribution as an architectural journal to the discipline, to the wider discipline of architecture as such. And I'm very happy to have you here tonight, Anh-Linh, and thank you. I'll pass again the mic to you. The screen's yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Tatjana. Thank you also to Jeanne for this presentation. And it has a lot to do with topics we've been dealing with recently. You've mentioned the Atlas of Commoning, which is in a way an open atlas collecting all these kind of histories and knowledge and etc., which we have seen in Jeanne's presentation also. And why doing this project, which has been traveling to Pittsburgh and was about to open in March in Mexico City, but then due to the corona pandemics, we had to cancel it, and we are now replanning. It might go to Buenos Aires and other venues in South and Middle Central Americas. So while we were doing the project An Atlas of Commoning, we also worked in parallel on a project which in a way deals with the totally contrary way of dealing with the city. It was when we started looking at the development of Berlin after the fall of the wall. And in a way, we were interested to see the many, many different ways of space production we've been collecting and discussing in the Atlas of Commoning, to see against which drawback we are, in fact, discussing these initiatives and projects and perspectives. And in fact, what we found out or were interested in was that most, of course, we all know it, most of the production of space happens well, on another scale and in another extent, so to say, budget-wise, but also politically, in a very formalized and also you were talking about the many histories of engaging with the urban. Here in Berlin, we just have a kind of a strongman approach to the urban, and that's what I would like to talk about, because that's the outcome of the exhibition and publication project we did with the Neue Berliner Kunstverein in 2019, well, commemorating or celebrating, so to say, the 30th anniversary of the fall of the wall. And let me just share the images. I hope it works. Do you see it? Okay, so what we did was, because the historical event of the fall of the Berlin Wall not only signified a geopolitical turning point in the confrontation between East and West, but also had very concrete effects on the development policies for Berlin. The place where the capitalist and the socialist world orders directly collided in space. And this development after the fall of the wall took place on 3 levels that correspond with 3 myths we have identified. So the first one you see here, Mythos der Geschichte, the myth of history, not histories, the myth of, the myth of the market, and the third one is the myth of creativity. So on the first, the political level, Berlin was to be restored as the capital of the unified Germany by deploying a kind of neo-historicism, which began with the invention of an allegedly Berlinische Architektur, Berlin architecture, that primarily served the need for historical continuity and national identity. But the architectural dispute of the 1990s obscured to some extent in our observation and analysis the actual transformation processes, which in addition to the political implications were primarily of an economic nature. After all, the victory of the market economy over socialism was not only to be expressed in the cityscape, among other things, by erasing the traces of the GDR modernism, as you can see here in the Palast der Republik, but also in the reconstruction of historical buildings, which is also part of this spatial policy. But besides of this kind of reconstruction processes, what the strongmen, I would call them now, for now, wanted to do is to make this process irreversible through a different economy of the city by implementing far-reaching reforms in order to carry out a comprehensive privatization of municipal properties. And the long-term consequences of this policy are placing at the moment the housing market and also the socio-spatial structure of the city under immense tension. So what we did was also look looking at, together with people like André Holm, at the level of the interaction or the policies, what kind of legal structures were invented in order to allow this kind of privatization going smoothly without anybody protesting against it in the beginning. So we ask ourselves, how does it function in this period that this desperate longing for continuity in a fragmented world, as Zygmunt Bauman put it in his book Retrotopia, how it concerns societies in transformation, just like the German or Berlin society after the fall of the wall. And in this respect, the urban sociologist Heike Delitz and her colleague Joachim Fischer pointed out about 10 years ago in our last Berlin issue that every society designs its own future. That is the idea of what it will be like tomorrow in the medium of space. And at the same time, every society also constructs its history, that is the knowledge of where it comes from and what is passing on to future generations also in the medium of space. Well, the fact that we design our own future is kind of self-evident. But what is relevant in this statement by Heike Delitz is that history is not a given, but is constantly being constructed according to the prevailing needs and ideologies of a certain society. So for cities in transformation, the tipping point between the construction of the future and the construction of the past is decisive. In the case of Berlin, we were witnessing and are still witnessing a unique process, because with the fall of the wall, the opposing processes of constructing future and history overlapped in Berlin. They became one and the same. That's quite interesting. The image of the city and thus of the society that was formed at that time was and is not a vision that looks into an undefined, uncertain future, but rather that is directed towards a supposedly reliable history. And of course, this history is also created and constructed, and that's what we tried to do in the exhibition with this installation, where we have asked the Berlin artist Daniel Poller to photograph as many as possible of these kind of reconstruction and historicist architectures built in the last 10 years only, and create a new kind of weird historicist Berlin scape that is the dream world of these kind of strongmen we are talking about. So the so-called Berlinische Architektur, Berlin architecture, or critical reconstruction, both stylistically evoke a certain bourgeois image of society from the interwar period, that is the period after the German Empire and just before the Nazi state. So concentrating on this period erases the ruptures caused by the Nazi era and of the war. And those were the ruptures that led to the post-war society that was highly self-reflective and self-aware of its historical guilt. In doing so, the eradication of the structural manifestations of the post-war period aims at this social consensus. And by, well, just literally erasing the unprocessed aspects of history. This is another level of the problematic and the entangled processes of the immediate post-reunification period, which we are talking about. And this period was focused on this longing for normalization. And as Michael Falser explains in his essay for this issue, which will come out in a few weeks, is the notion of normalization has not only to do with the idea of a normal, allegedly Prussian architectural style and a reconstructed, idealized city plan, as we know it for Berlin, but also with the idea of a normalized bourgeois society whose members own parts of the city. And here is where the economic core of the politics of space in the new Berlin comes into light. And the main aim of this policy was to privatize the communalized property in the eastern part of the city and to reduce the welfare state structures on both sides of the city to a minimum. And that's what the outcome looks like at the moment in Berlin. It's just recently built. And in the exhibition, we presented this progressive privatization of public real estate in Berlin since the fall of the wall in the form of a map. And for the first time, we were able to clearly illustrate the extent of the sale of land. As you all know, in at least 10 to 15 years, Berlin has been discussing the consequences of the privatization policy quite critically, but no one had any concrete figures because the politics and the administration have denied access with reference to data protection. Although public property has been sold and we as citizens should have the right to the information. But it was not possible, and we almost failed to present this map as evidence. And during our research, we finally came across the study by Florine Schuschke, who had succeeded in tracking and evaluating around 90% of the cases in which the Senate had privatized public property in the past 3 decades. And as expected, most of the privatizations took place, of course, in the former East Berlin. But it was not only land which was privatized, but also this social housing stock was privatized to a considerable extent. The sum of all the properties that the Berlin Senate has privatized since the fall of the wall, well, that's what Florine Schuschke has been able to reference, at least, adds up to an area of almost 21 million square meters. So in order to give you an image of the extent, that size of 21 million square meters corresponds roughly to the size of Berlin, of the Berlin district of Friedrichshain-Kreuzberg. And if such enormous part of the city is being privatized in such a short period of time, and then subsequently subjected to speculative developments, of course, rising land prices and rents and a lack of building sites are inevitable consequences. And in particular, it also has the logical consequence that the public sector can no longer control and or influence the development process. A large part of the non-reproducible land that was in public hands was transferred to the private sector. And it is the nature of the private sector to want to maximize profits. And that's what we are currently confronted with as a problem. So these consequences, to come to the main point, is mostly the consequence, of course, of ideology. After all, the market is also a kind of ideology. And already in 1994, Hans Stimmann, then Senate Building Director for Development in Berlin, spoke of the new spatial policy as a reverse revolution. And Dieter Hoffmann-Axel, an expert who worked for Stimmann to put into action the idea of critical reconstruction with the inner city plan, has defined modernity as the aesthetic correlate of dictatorship in another context. So these two statements flash pure ideology, but they were able to advocate critical reconstruction with purely architectural and urban planning arguments, and they succeeded in doing so. But ideology alone is not enough to win a revolution, as Henri Lefebvre noted in his book, The Production of Space. Just a short quote in this context. A revolution that does not produce a new space has not realized its full potential, he writes. Indeed, it has failed in that it has not changed life itself, but has merely changed ideological superstructures, institutions, or political apparatuses. So according to Lefebvre's standard, the reverse revolution in Berlin was extremely successful because it is ingrained in everyday life, in our language. We just happily, everybody talk about the European city nowadays. The politicians think that's the way to deal with problems, etc. But above all, it is inscribed, it inscribed itself in space and has left deep marks in the lives of a large number of Berliners in forms of rising rents and displacement. Instead of combining the best of both worlds after the fall of the wall, this city was unilaterally reshaped after the neoliberal model. And today we are feeling the consequences of this policy in full force, as I've just mentioned before. And perhaps these consequences have something to do with the fact that we never properly understood the instrument that divided Berlin in the first place, which is the wall. That we never properly understood its physical and material significance. And interestingly, the only one who took the wall, the Berlin Wall, seriously as architecture was the young Rem Koolhaas. In 1971, as a student of the London Architectural Association, he went on an excursion to Berlin to research the wall as an architectural object. And contrary to the idea of a also morally clean division, he was confronted with the situation that it was in fact a so-called free part of the city that was enclosed by a wall. And this spatial awareness triggered a shock for him because it relativized his concept of freedom, and he looked for a moment into the abyss of architecture and called it later, we are voluntary prisoners of architecture. So the Berlin Wall as a prototypical architecture revealed that the drawing of boundaries, the division, enclosure, and exclusion are among the essential strategies of architecture. This paradoxical basic condition of architecture is perhaps the most important lesson that we can draw from the historical situation for today. Because today we are again confronted with the role of architecture as a tool of social inclusion and exclusion. Since the fall of the Berlin Wall, the number of physical and immaterial walls have grown. Instead of dividing the world into different political blocks, the new walls separate the haves and the not haves, so to say, in space. And in essence, this is exactly what it is about when we speak abstractly of inclusion and exclusion, of gentrification and displacement. It's about separating the haves and the have-nots from each other. That can be, so the question is to end, what can the city learn from Berlin's divided past today? Well, immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, we could have tried to combine both systems and learn from each other. In terms of spatial policy, it is now almost too late because most of the public land has been privatized. The problem is that once the commons are privatized, there is virtually no return. After all, it is extremely difficult to recommunalize resources. But nevertheless, this is exactly a topic that has been receiving a boost in Berlin for a few years now. Not only individual houses return to the public sector via the communal right to buy, but a municipal land fund suddenly became politically possible. And the Senate just, established the Bodenfonds, Berliner Bodenfonds, just this year. And in response to the housing crisis, initiatives such as Deutsche Wohnen and Eignen are calling even for expropriation, the recommunalization of large housing companies that have benefited in the past from the privatization of public housing on very favorable terms. So, and just recently, a few weeks ago, a community land trust in German Stadtwohnstiftung was recently set up by civil society. The immense extent of the housing crisis has made these extremely sensitive issues possible. So in addition to the land question in which we on which we have worked in another issue, Berlin's main focus is the idea of the bottom-up city, of the commoning processes. We just heard in other places by Jeanne. And that's a very strong part also of the histories of the city of Berlin. So, and this includes the historical experiences of the squatters movement just before reunification until the 80s, the interim use of the post-reunification period, but also recent initiatives and projects such as Ex-Rotterdam, Mietshäuser-Syndikat, Tenement Syndicate, or projects like Haus der Statistik or Dragone-Areal, where people were able to reclaim public resources. And such projects can draw on the wealth of experiences of the divided city. And they are important places or spaces for social experiments. But what distinguishes this generation from its predecessors, however, is that it goes beyond the pure, I would like to quote, go beyond the pure existential experimentalism that sociologist Heinz Bude identified as a hallmark of the squatter scene and movement of the 1980s. In his recently published novel Aufprall, Impact, written together with Bettina Munk and Karin Wieland, Bude still attaches the radicalism of his generation to the absence of utopia and to the attempt to experiment life in a concrete space, as he puts it. In contrast, today's protagonists in the urban struggles combine concrete projects and experiments with a utopian horizon in the sense of the land question, as I've just discussed, or the commons. And that's encouraging because we can only change society in the long term by combining both project and utopia. Thank you.
So I'm back here. Thank you very much, Anh-Linh, for this very intensive, quite a lot to take in, I think. I think I would have liked to have both your talks in a written version before to really sort of engage also with the complexities of the language. You, I think there's many points that we could bring Jeanne back on, but before she joins us again, maybe I'll ask or try to ask a couple of questions. It's a very sort of I think when you talk about Berlin, you very often talk about the city, no? And in a way, of course, no, the city becomes then this sort of massive hegemonic force in a way that is like this, no? It's like this beast, no? This head of a beast, this kind of force that you can't really reckon with because it's so powerful, these kind of drivers that shape certain things. And this one graphic you showed, there were also then these the mayors, and there were also the finance senators. But at the same time, what I think is also important maybe to talk about is this very difficult notion of complicity of each and every one of us in these systems. And I think this is something you've been dealing with as well personally, but also with Arch Plus, that to a certain degree, and maybe this is also why this generation of ours in a way, or even the younger generation is maybe not looking at different ways of doing this too, because in a way the kind of our pension funds, our own sort of way of living have obviously contributed to the kind of build-up of these architectures to a certain degree as well. Our choices of living, of voting, of doing this. No? So the political parties at the head, and they're not just there. No? How do you address this? Or is this an interest of yours at all, or does it then only come in when you look at the more current alternatives?
No, of course. In the issue we are currently working on, this is quite a big question in terms of the profession of architects and planners. And for example, the project I just showed briefly by Guerilla Architects, who did performances in the city, in the area of the Media Spree. And by dealing with these 1 square meters of Berlin, they were exactly raising this question of complicity and of the role of architects and planners in the shaping of the urban. And I think that's quite important to look at. And they dealt with this on different levels. They looked at the language of the planners who kind of help the investors to commodify even the squatter movement of the 80s by selling, we are talking about big firm in Berlin, by selling the headquarters of Zalando to the millionaires who have it built as a place where they can squat the space, and where they sell these atriums as marketplaces where you can meet and so on. So even on the level of the language, we are complicit. And we are also complicit, of course, as planners working for these kind of institutions, and also we have a very important contribution by Niloufar Tajeri, who's your teaching assistant in Braunschweig, and who's fighting against the project, the reconstruction of the department store by Signa at Hermannplatz in Berlin. And here, the architects and the planners are complicit in the way that they use the language of architecture, of the historical architecture, to sell it as an ideological argument for the developer to sell it to the society. So I think that even on the level of architecture itself, we are complicit in a way. But of course, just like in other bigger questions like climate change, we are all complicit in our own lives. So that's another question we have to deal with personally. But what we are trying to do is to look at the profession and to deal to raise this question of complicity on a more ideological level, so to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I was even referring to even beyond the profession. Huh? So I think this, but I really like that you brought in architects, planners, and so on and so forth as well, because obviously that's a big part in making that visible or creating these representational spaces that you've showed as well. Could I ask on the side, maybe Jeanne, to slowly come back in again, because in a way, what I see in both of your approaches, in a way, what you seem to be doing, Anh-Linh, is somehow making those very dominant practices visible and sort of bringing them to the fore and sort of talking about them. So taking away that sort of whatever the kind of big front, the kind of and sort of fragmenting the thing and making it negotiable in a way. And what you seem to be doing, Jeanne, is to come at it from the other side, no? And almost you have those hegemonies somewhere there, but in a way you're also if I may say, ignore them, and you totally concentrate on the other side of the coin. No? You do say, and of course you talk about resistance, you talk about all those things, but at the same time, in your practice, you seem to be focusing on assisting and helping helping to forge maybe these kind of networks from below that resist those powers maybe in the first place. And I find that quite interesting. These two very different approaches. One seems to be coming also from the very bottom, no? The other one maybe from another perspective. Could you, is that too complex? Could you reflect on this maybe a little bit? If you know, I don't know whether you see my question here. I think what I see in your work, Jeanne, is this kind of. I wondered when I looked at Anh-Lin's presentation how you would come in. What would your approach be to to somehow counter those narratives? If I were to commission you now, what would you do?
That, of course, is a very complex question. But I think like one of the things that is important to understand, like I say, from the practice, is that it exactly maybe not necessarily immediately wants to counter-argue that what is already there, but it goes to look for that what is not argued yet, so it doesn't need to be counter-argued. So maybe there are big narratives that are out there that are constantly being reinscribed in our cities that actually serve dominant ideologies, dominant ideologies of how space should be produced, for who space is. So if you go in a position of trying to counter-argue that, then you're still in opposition. And I think sometimes I go maybe sideways, looking for those forms of producing space that keeps communities alive, that creates resilience, that are practices of care, of commoning, of communal resourcing, of like building community wealth, and look how they can be strengthened in a way that they can become stronger in their own presence, but also find ways to net them among each other. I think the practice is super important. When I talk about radicalizing the local, I mean it in the sense of like the two ways that the word, you can use the word is as in becoming emergent, so making things emergent, which is not the same as making things visible, but make them emerge while rerouting them into other networks. So this making emergent and rerouting in stronger networks. And I think that is just a total different, not a different, but it's almost a side practice to like sort of like the dominant narrative. And I think it's important because I feel like I mean, like in the production of space, there's so many things that need to be questioned, not only ideologies, but also our procurement contracts, our design contracts, our ownership contracts, our everything that we sort of seem to all not take for granted, but that we all use in our practices, that I think we need to look at other ways of thinking about how we can hold space together and then try to strengthen them in a way through combining and knitting that we can create alternatives. And I think land trusts are a perfect example for it. I mean, in Home Baked or Two Up, Two Down Home Baked, it took many years, but now we are the owners of the land. And we are actually building at the moment affordable houses and more community spaces next to the bakery. But this is a trajectory of 10 years. And the way that the community there always says, like, we needed to learn everything. You know, we needed to learn how to manage land, what a land trust is. So these are also trajectories of learning together what is needed for instance, owning land. And these are very steep learning curves, you know, especially if we do that with a variety group of people with maybe different senses of place.
I think I can relate to it quite directly, because in fact, we should have turned the presentations around and to have you like continue with the land trust, which I ended with. But it was also the way we worked in reality. We started first with the Atlas of Commoning, with the idea of strengthening the network and building a narrative which says that this is a strong narrative. It's not an insular like practice we are talking about, or practices, but it has the strength of the network in a global context. And that's also the idea of the traveling project, where at each site we want to include other practices, local practices, into the Atlas and make it grow as a common knowledge resource, so to say. But while we were dealing with it, and we saw also the struggles of people to sustain these kind of practices in terms of how do you make it economically viable, and how do you like bring it into a trajectory which is viable in terms just like the question of ownership, of legal structure. You have to learn and to know what you are, well, how do you exist parallel or in resistance to these bigger narratives we are talking about. So that's the reason why we went back, so to say, to the source of the evils and the source of the problem, in order to contrast it with the other alternatives, which are in themselves strong and not just insular.
Mm. Yeah, I just wanted to know whether I don't know. Have you begun to visualize, Anh-Linh, also these forces, and to really name them in a way?
Well, I mean, what we try to do with the issue is, of course, to first of all, put it on the table and have the profession deal with their own complicity. And I don't know, of course, we could use, we asked Niloufar and her colleagues to draw a map, a mapping of the construction of Signa, how they act as an entity, and how they use different resources to influence politics, to influence civil society also. They mimic in a way the bottom-up strategies of the projects we are talking about, like Jeanne's, and they are shamelessly copying these kind of projects in order to win the argument. So we cannot be naive anymore, because they know how to navigate and how to deal with resistance. So resistance is not a value in itself, but you have to have a goal where you want to sideways or to navigate. And so that's what we can do within such a small project with little fundings, an exhibition, a program, and also an issue.
Mm. Yeah, I think maybe coming back to this notion of the sideways, which is, I think, super interesting. I myself have done a fair bit on this kind of, not talking about an alternative in a way, but sort of defining the other as something so powerful that you don't always go into opposition, as you said, Jeanne. As soon as you counter something, you're in opposition, and you're defining yourself by that, or through that opposition also to the other. I still wonder also at times whether, you know, how you then take certain things. is it always, it's a bit of a silly question, I guess, no? Is it always enough, or are there moments where you feel like I would like to really have this enshrined in a certain political way, or is it sometimes that people participate or come along or are part of these actions which actually say, well, I actually want to take this further and contractually put it down in some ways? Or is this just something, I mean, you've been doing it, I guess, with home baked, no? You're engaging also with the formation of structures in certain ways. Is this something, is it just a project by project thing that it comes and then you engage with it, but you don't actively seek it, I guess?
I think that is sort of like I like what I try to say is like sort of like based on the questions that I derive from the territory. There is this kind of like atmospheric fields of questions that then becomes the field of interaction, which I'm part of. And I always say I have a pretty loud voice, so but I think also I think it's then about collectively working the territory together, and this means that we need to start building up capacity together to understand legal formation, land rights, procurement contracts, forms of running a business. And I think what one of the most difficult thing is to buy time in these processes, because the way that sometimes these processes go, like is that the pre-planning, like in the Afrikanerwijk, happens years in advance. So by the time actually the thing really starts to emerge, almost all I call that the invisible legislation is already in place. The ground is prepared. So that's why I speak about the rooting and the preparing the ground. So like, how can we start preparing the ground for the things that we need? So what is our groundwork that we need to do? And this is building capacity, knowledge together. And for that also thinking about financial structures that can hold such a thing. So like for my practice, it's always super important that we work with cooperative wages. So that means that the baker and the architect, then there's not so much difference between the two of them in the way they are remunerated for their work, so that it becomes a collective endeavor. And of course, in all of the work, there are moments in which also products are made or things are made that can help sustain the project, like baking bread, or like in the Afrikanerwijk, performing work in the area. So I think this balance is a very difficult one to be found, but I think it is also of key importance to create those spaces, or to carve out the spaces that gives us time to collectively learn what we think we need to move these things forward. And I'm not naive about that. I'm also pretty aware, I always said, that you are complicit or that your hands are dirty. But I do think it's important to actually, there where most of our development is linear and has a neoliberal linear trajectory, is to basically create other modes of time to work. So, and I think that's super important. So that's why I talk quite often about the work about time-based performative, and not so much about performance, but for ourselves to allow this time to grow and learn together. So I find that very important.
Yeah, I think time is crucial also as a resource, because when we had our exhibition and discussion format in Pittsburgh, in the US, we had local initiatives coming in, and there were one woman, and I find it quite extraordinary what she said, because in order to engage with these kind of commoning processes, you need, first of all, time to do so. And what she were doing was working her ass off, so to say, and then saving monies in order to be able to be a professional citizen for 1 year. That's what she said. I wanted to be a professional citizen in order to be able to engage in these kind of processes and projects and initiatives. So it's not about only that you can do it, but you have to be able also financially and economically in order to engage yourself in these kind of projects. And I think for that reason, it's really important to think about the economic basis of these kind of projects in order to allow people to come in.
Yeah, I think thank you for bringing that to the table, because that's for me of utmost importance to also ask who can spend those time or who can take the risk to be part of these projects. So and that's why I think a big portion of my time goes into finding ways to resource these work in order for people to be there. So for instance, in Philadelphia Assembled, we looked at what was the living wage in Philadelphia, and based off that living wage, people coming to the meetings were getting a stipend of $17 an hour, travel expenses and childcare, and we would always provide a warm meal in order to make sure that people could eat, not assuming people would have had a warm meal. So to resource these meetings in a way that as many people as possible can take the time or to be part of this. So I think to me that's an extremely important project. What I said, they always have a component that helps things to ways of resourcing this spending time together, you know. So
Great.
I think it's extremely important. I still remember the comment from somebody at the Philadelphia Museum of Art said, but we're not going to pay the whole city to participate. And I'm like, no, it's not about paying people to participate, but it's valuing people's contributions in a way that they can take part in this endeavor, and to not take for granted that everybody can do that for free or voluntary or in any other way. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
And to also see it as a public practice. I think it's a public practice if people work.
Professional citizens.
Professional citizens, I like that word.
Okay.
Professional citizens, fantastic. I don't know. I thank you at the moment. I would bring it to a close. There's this format is a little bit strange, but I think your contributions were absolutely great. It's a bit of shame that we could not meet in the exhibition as well, and maybe talk live, and maybe also in that context of that space, which of course raises very, very many questions that you've addressed here tonight as well. I would really like to thank you for your insightful presentations of bringing up these notions of knowledges and histories again, and and also in the end now talking about this really important notion also of time, and who can afford to, and how to make it possible actually in ways in so many ways to give that time as well. So thank you very much again for being here tonight. We could have a glass of wine now separately in our living room, so together, glass of water. I would also like to thank the audience who was here on Vimeo and on Instagram Live and so on and so forth. And maybe just to say that until the end of November, we are in this digital space. Hopefully returning to the space of the exhibition in December. We'll see how it goes, but for now, thank you very much for being here tonight, for sharing your stories, and thank you. So
thank you for hosting us. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. So, very nice to meet you also.
Yeah, very nice meeting you. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.